Hi, everyone. All right, so today I want to talk a little bit about sex, gender, and gender roles. These are terms that tend to get misused a lot in the broad popular culture. Um, People often talk about gender when they mean to talk about sex, or they talk about sex when they mean to talk about gender, or in some cases, people often just assume that sex and gender are sort of the same thing. So I want to spend a little bit of time making it clear what these terms mean, critique a little bit of the construction of these terms, and a little bit of where the behavioral expectations that exist in society that are built around either sex category or gender um, come to be. So where does this concept of sex and where does this concept of gender come from, and how do they operate? So let's start with sex. So sex is defined as the biological fact of femaleness or maleness. This has to do with the underlying biological makeup of complementary reproductive systems. So, as a species, humans reproduce sexually. That means we have to have um, a particular set of genital characteristics and biological capacities in order for that to happen. And some members of our species produce sperm. Other members of our species have ova, eggs, right, and a place to gestate a fertilized egg, uterus. So those things are biologically real. While we in the social sciences will describe sex as a social construct, and it absolutely is, that doesn't mean that there aren't elements of biological sex that are just sort of, again, functions of our makeup as a biological species, as organisms. Um, the the problematic or limited nature of the construct isn't that there aren't differences between males and females. There absolutely are. It's that male and female is sort of the only uh, are the only two categories that exist. We in our culture we construct sex as a binary, right? So that there are females and there are males, right? A binary is just a category in which there are two options. So we've constructed a sort of model or an understanding of sex in which people are either female or male, and that's based on whether they have certain genital characteristics, or in more recent decades, certain types of chromosomal makeup or other associated features. Remember, the categories have existed long before we understood chromosomes and hormones and genetics. So the extent to which people can sort of point to those things and say those are why we have these categories are sort of missing out on the historical sequence. What's happened, of course, is that as we've discovered things about human beings at a genetic level, at a hormonal level, a chromosomal level, we've done that through the lens of looking at sex as this kind of binary construct. In fact, when we look at genital characteristics, we see that there are some people who are arguably unambiguously male. We see that there are other people who are arguably and unambiguously female. And then we see some people who have characteristics of both sexes, in which case the idea that there are two and only two categories of sex becomes increasingly problematic. A recent response to this has been to sort of treat people in that kind of intermediate category as what we call intersex. Um, and it's forced a conversation about the nature of our construct. For some people, there's just this obstinate unwillingness to deal with the actual complexity that biology presents us with, and to just sort of insist that there are two and only two categories. Um, it's probably better to think of sex as bimodal as opposed to binary, right? So instead of two and only two categories, we can think of maleness and femaleness as a cluster of traits and tendencies at the biological level, and look at the variation in those traits and tendencies, and sort of see two distributions which overlap to a certain degree toward the middle of those distributions. So some people have argued constructing sex on a continuum instead of as a binary, right? With male at one end and female at the other end, and then all of the variability sort of plotted out on that line in between the two. That probably gets us past the limitations and I think the inaccuracy of describing sex as a binary, but it still doesn't really do much to critique or to give us a way to get past the other limitation of this construct, which is that it's also constructed in an oppositional fashion. So we say that sex is constructed as an oppositional binary, in which male and female aren't just different, they're actually opposites. So the closer you get to being male and possessing traits that we associate with maleness, the farther you're getting away from femaleness. And again, it's just a construct. It doesn't there's no biological mandate that we conceptualize sex as difference, oppositional difference as opposed to just difference. Nevertheless, we do, and so the biases, the kind of cognitive structures that we bring to our critique and analysis of sex and how sex operates is still ultimately being filtered through some constructs that are really, really tricky, right? So if we see male and female as opposites, as opposed to just different and complementary when it comes to reproduction, we are going to have, as a society, an understanding that men and women really do live in very, very different sorts of conditions, right? That the nature of being female is going to put one in a position where their lives and their world and their experiences are going to be vastly not just different, but the opposite of men. And that's again, as I've said, a kind of problematic construct. It leads to certain outcomes. One of which is the way that we as a culture and a society understand gender. So gender, a little bit different. While sex refers to biology, gender is going to refer to behavior and cultural understandings and cultural definitions of what we mean by feminine and masculine. And now these things are really tricky, right? Because what constitutes feminine behavior varies from society to society, from within a society over time. Within groups, within the larger society, there are different understandings of gender and gender roles, which I'll talk about in a moment. The problem is, of course, that we engage in this process of sort of trying to make gender differences in some way a reflection of underlying biological sex differences. And as a result, gender differences are understood to be also binary and oppositional, right? Because that's the nature of the underlying sex category on which gender is presumably based. I say presumably because there's a lot of evidence that there isn't as much of a connection between underlying biological sex and gender behaviors. And again, I'll get into that in just a moment. But out of this notion of gender, we get a set of expectations and behavioral patterns that are learned, right? So we see that men and women, biological males and biological females, are socialized very differently. And as a result of that, acquire different behavioral patterns. So when we talk about gender roles, right, this is a reference to the understandings that we have of gender difference that is kind of predicated on or that emphasizes the things that individuals learn in that socialization process. So we look at the behavioral expectations in society of males and the behavioral expectations in society of females, and we get masculine and feminine. We get those gendered understandings. And to make matters even more complicated, it is also the case that we do not treat biological sexes equitably, which in turn means that we have gender inequality. So we're getting kind of an amalgamation of biological features of human organisms, sociocultural features of society like role expectations and behavioral expectations just broadly, and then the differential treatment, the differential ranking of the things that men do and that women do. So when we look at gender stratification, we see, for example, phenomena like the wage gap, in which women get paid less than men, or we see, different expectations for females, women, in the context of other institutional arrangements like education or family or governance, than apply to males and to men. So, this gender stratification complicates things even a bit more further. So I want to talk about the way in which all of those things are kind of interrelated, but I want to talk a little bit first in exploring that by looking at the biological basis for these gender roles, right? So we know that there's a biological basis for sex difference, right? That biological males, cannot gestate a fetus. Their breasts do not lactate and provide milk. Right? So there are physiological differences between biological males and biological females. Those are not gender differences. It is not gender to say that, or you're not making a statement about gender if you observe that only women can have, can gestate fetuses and deliver babies. Men, I want to be really clear here, although this will probably complicate things a little bit. Men, not males, but men, right now I'm talking about gender, men can gestate a fetus. Some men, not all men, but trans men can, right? So somebody who was born with the biological ability to conceive a baby and gestate a fetus and deliver it, but who transition to or engage in gender behaviors that are specific to men and who identify as men and present themselves to others as men, have not necessarily given up any kind of underlying biological differences they were born with, and therefore could presumably lactate, could presumably gestate and deliver a fetus. And that would be consistent if people were operating with an understanding that biological sex and gender are not the same thing. That biological sex is not a completely immutable feature of our physiology, right? Men or females can have their genital organs surgically altered. Males can have their genital organs surgically altered. And as a result, you could have let's see if I can keep this straight, somebody who was assigned female at birth, who transitioned in terms of gender to male, and then who had surgical procedures to remove the female reproductive organs that were present when that person was born. And over time, they become physically different as a result, in this case, of surgical procedures. But in the absence of those surgical procedures, there's nothing that prevents them from transitioning in terms of gender, right? Gender is a relatively easy transition. I don't mean it's easy in an objective sense, but I think relative to biological alteration, gender is a little bit more malleable because it is a shared set of understandings that is not grounded in underlying biological distinctiveness. So I hope that hasn't created too much confusion, but if it has, obviously we can talk about this in class. But talking now about gender and its presumed underlying biological foundations, I want to observe a couple of things, all right, having said all of that. So first of all, chromosomal and hormonal differences do create physical differences within human organisms. So sex differentiation, for example, begins to occur after about 6 weeks following conception, right? So from the first month and a half, there's no real difference biologically in the sex of a fetus. That sex differentiation begins to occur at about 6 weeks. Secondary sex characteristics, right? Things like larger breasts or facial hair or some of these other more physically apparent differences biologically between males and females, those begin to appear at the onset of puberty as hormones are released by the body, triggering particular physiological changes and developments. So those things are real, right? The chromosomal and hormonal differences do create actual physical differences. What happens, though, is that the gender norms that exist in a society or a culture kind of build on or exacerbate or reinforce those physical differences. But they are not necessarily connected to the physical differences, right? These are understandings that we build in terms of what we expect people who are biologically sexed female or what we expect people who are biologically sexed male to do. The kinds of behaviors, the kinds of attitudes, the kinds of broad social expectations. Here's the evidence, though, that those differences are not uniformly shaped from our genetic makeup. In other words, they're not determined by our physical sex, but rather how we as a society socialize people of different sexes differently, and the expectations that we as a society have of people who occupy different sex categories. So the first thing you need to remember is that femininity and masculinity, which is gender, are not uniformly shaped from genetic makeup or biology, which would be sex. So the evidence for that is that these differences, the gendered behaviors that we observe in societies around the world, vary, right? They vary from culture to culture, and they vary within a culture over time. So being masculine in the United States looks very different in 2022 than it did in 1922 or 1822 or 1722. Well, there wasn't really a United States in 1722, but you follow my logic, I hope. So if these things are immutable sort of reflections of underlying physiological difference, they wouldn't change, right? Because our evolution, our biological evolution doesn't move at that kind of speed. We see gender behaviors and gender norms shifting quite rapidly, far more rapidly than would reflect an underlying change in biological sex. So again, they vary from culture to culture, and they vary within a culture over time. Gender norms vary over the course of a lifetime for somebody who is female and somebody who is male, right? So the femininity in young girls looks different than femininity in adolescent girls, which looks different than femininity in young women, which looks different than femininity in women who are much older, right? Same with men, right? So again, the notions of what gendered behaviors are appropriate to males and females depends on sort of the temporal context, right? When in the life stage do we find these various males and females? Because that will tell us which gender behaviors are appropriate. And again, that's cultural, that's not biological. They also, of course, vary within and between groups of women and men. So there are variations in gender by social class. There are variations in gender by race and by ethnicity. There are variations in gendered behaviors by sexuality. So again, if these things were inextricably connected to and necessarily connected to underlying biology, there would not be nearly so much variability, right? right? And that sort of suggests very strongly that, and again, the fact that somebody can transition, the fact that somebody who was assigned, say, male at birth or female at birth, could become a trans woman or a trans man at some later point in life, doesn't mean they're altering their biological makeup or their genetics, but rather they're engaging in a set of social behaviors that we broadly recognize as appropriate to a sex that is different from the sex that this person might have been assigned at birth. The reason why we do this, the reason why we make this strong connection between gendered behaviors and underlying sex category is that we have this kind of you might call it a lens or frame through which we sort of make sense of and structure our understanding of gender. Specifically, the frame of biological essentialism. So biological essentialism is basically a view that gender differences reflect deep, natural, and innate sex differences. And so because we have a tendency to do this, because we have a tendency to assume that because somebody is female, they must be really, really good at nurturing, and they must be really, really good at conflict resolution and being emotive and forming affective connections and bonds. And because other people are biologically male, they must be more rational and they must be more calculating and aggressive, right? And those assumptions are just that. They're just assumptions. We look at an outcome, which is a society structured around gender differences, and we assume then that those gender differences must reflect the underlying biology. But in fact, they reflect the way in which we differentially treat people based on the biological category into which they've been assigned. So the biological basis for sex roles is not particularly well founded, but it's fairly solid in terms of how people treat it, right? Which means that they're much less likely to recognize the social basis for gender roles. So the social bases for gender roles are fairly well documentable. They're fairly well explored and understood, but they're not broadly known, right? These are things that people pick up in, say, a gender studies class or a sociology class or an anthropology class. Sometimes maybe a little bit of biology, but because biology sees many of the same limitations and problems with the social constructs that we use to make sense of biological sex and, as a result, gender. But it is true, when we look at the social foundations or the social basis for gender roles, we see that all societies feature some kind of a gendered division of labor. And those essentialist arguments, remember the biological essentialism, those essentialist ideals result in us assigning expressive roles to females and instrumental roles to males. The problem is, of course, when we look across societies, we see that while there is a fairly high degree of sex based division of labor in a wide variety of societies, I'm thinking specifically of anthropologists like what was the guy's name? Murdoch, I think, was the name of the anthropologist who looked at several hundred or a couple hundred societies and recorded all of the tasks that are done in those societies and looked at how many of those things were exclusively assigned to males, how many were exclusively assigned to females, and how many were done by a mix of both people. And while a lot of societies did have highly segregated divisions of labor in which women were only supposed to do certain tasks and only men were supposed to do other tasks, what those tasks were varied from society to society. So every society has a sex-based division of labor, but the tasks to which females and males get assigned in that division of labor vary from society to society, which suggests that the reason why we do this is not so much that there's an underlying biological difference, it's that our understandings of those differences and our understandings of the impact or consequences of those differences have led us to sort of put males and females and men and women then into different categories with regard to social expectations with regard to how they behave. And what's resulted from that, of course, is the establishment of what we call gendered institutions. And a gendered institution is just, as I suggest, an institution, an entire institution that's patterned by gender. So family, for example, is a very good example of a gendered institution in which we see, a fairly rigorous divide in terms of the expectations of males and females. Again, they vary from society to society and within societies over time, but it is still possible to structure a social institution around a construct. It doesn't have to be structured around an objectively and permanently real underlying physical difference. So socially defined differences between genders ultimately end up legitimizing male dominance, right? That's the thing we see in all of these societies. The one constant is male dominance. By the way, this is true even if not all men feel dominant. We're going to talk in the next video a little bit about intersectionality, in which we explore that a little bit. But again, this is what we would call a social fact, right? Something that is true of society, even if it's not true of all of the people in that society. So when we look at the way that race and class and sexuality and other things work together to produce differences between women, differences among women and differences among men, you can have men who don't necessarily feel dominant even in a society that's characterized by male dominance. And again, that will get explored a little bit more when we talk about intersectionality in the next video. I did want to say a quick thing about another one of those lenses, or another one of those kind of biases or beliefs that sort of play a role in structuring all of this, and that is the idea of androcentrism, what we would call male dominance. Androcentrism is basically all of the, because again, ISM always refers to a belief system. Androcentrism refers to the beliefs and the values and cultural meanings that ultimately give higher value to masculinity than femininity, higher prestige to masculinity than femininity, and that, of course, institutionalize male control of socially valuable resources. We can see this, by the way. We can see androcentrism illustrated in how society responds to gender transgression. So when you look at pre-adolescent boys and girls, so kids 5, 6, 7, 8 years old, right, before the onset of puberty, girls who do things that we have historically and typically associated with males are called tomboys. In our culture, in our society, tomboys are generally regarded as acceptable, right? That tomboy is not a slur. It is possibly something that people hope that young girls grow out of, but it isn't seen as largely pejorative or negative. On the other hand, little boys who do things that we typically associate with girls are often called sissies or pansies or mama's boys. Those are definitely insults. Those are pejorative. Those are not meant to be just descriptors or compliments in the way that tomboy might be. And the reason for that is, in a society where things that we associate with males are valued, people pursuing those things are generally understood to be pursuing a culturally valued position or resource or status. So girls who want to be more like boys makes sense in a society where boys are sort of the dominant group, the prestigious group. Girls wanting to be girls is completely normal because that's what girls do. Boys wanting to be more like girls is seen as an abdication of one's privilege, an abdication of one's privileged status, and is very much looked down on and viewed negatively. And then, of course, the social consequences of doing that are specifically to create a kind of conformity to those gendered expectations. And that's, the underlying ideology that's behind this notion of male dominance is exactly that. It's this androcentric tendency to see the things that we associate with men as more valuable than the things that we associate with women. And when we get this in a fully socially institutionalized form, we get what's called patriarchy, right? So patriarchy is a kind of social organization in which males dominate females, but it's really, at the end of the day, institutionalized androcentrism. It's institutionalized male dominance. And this is the norm. This is the norm in all modern societies. We could go back historically in the anthropological records, and we could find some early societies that might have been matriarchal in nature and operation, but in the modern world there are no matriarchies. They're what we call unicorns, in the sense that, if I were to show you one, everyone would go, "Oh my God, look, that's a unicorn," because we would all recognize it if we saw it. The problem is, of course, that these matriarchies don't exist, so they're fictitious creatures that we could describe one, but we're not going to see one in the world around us, if you will, because they don't actually exist, and ergo, sometimes people will call them unicorns for that reason. All right, so that should do it for this session. As I said, next time we'll talk a little bit about intersectionality and the way in which things like race and ethnicity, sex, gender, sexuality, other kinds of statuses that we all occupy kind of work together, because that is, in fact, sort of the nature of the social operation of these things. We've taken them apart to sort of look at them kind of one or two at a time, but they don't really ever completely operate like that. Everything kind of operates in an interactive and heuristic fashion. And intersectionality is going to give us a really good sort of analytical framework to think about that actual operation of things, rather than sort of the reductive way of looking at just at race, or just at ethnicity, or just at sex, or just at gender. So we're going to think about how those things work together. But as I said, that's next time. So until then, take care.